So here we are in part 3 of the AM Detector series, and I want to thank you for all your patience. I'm going slow because we ran into a little controversy last time, and this controversy is between believers of the envelope rectification method of, demodulation in the crystal set versus the product detection mixing square law detection in the crystal set. So we had this going on. Now, you guys don't want hand waving. We've had enough math. It's not about that. It's about understanding what's happening with the diode, what's happening in the detection process. So let's start with asking a lot of people what they think. And my best response was from W7ZOI Wes Hayward. Wes said, "I don't know." The most beautiful thing I heard in all of the comments was, "I don't know." And that means that nobody's really thought about this or tested the theory before. And I'm going to try to test it in a practical manner. Practical manner meaning on the bench. And how can we determine what's going on in a semiconductor diode? According to the theory and according to the math, in the envelope detector, we have a finite amount of distortion that occurs as you go low modulation index, from 10% all the way up to 90 or 100%. The distortion's rather low with an envelope detector. Most envelope detectors happen after several stages of RF gain up front. So by the 1930s, detectors were not being used like crystal radios. Detectors were at the end of a chain of RF amplifiers, as with a TRF3 dialer, or at the end of a super heterodyne type IF system. So think of the envelope detector as being a high-level detector in that case. So we still don't have an answer. To get an answer, we're going to have to look at the math, and the math tells us that an envelope detector is a low distortion type detector all the way up to high modulation indexes. However, the product detector version of AM demodulation, you start to see distortion creep in much after 30%, 40%, the distortion will creep up. So I've been able to get my hands on an arbitrary waveform generator where I can make an almost perfect AM signal. I can make it give us any type of modulation index, and I can set the level for whatever we want. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure the energy that we're seeing at the diode in a typical sweep of the dial. And all we're going to do is put a substitute for the diode at that point. It could be a 5K resistor, and we'll call that the diode, and we'll do an AC measurement and see how much RF we're actually giving the diode to detect. Let's look at the strongest signal. He looks pretty strong, but I am on the 5 millivolt per division scale. 5 millivolts. Let's look at the RMS value. This is a ×1 probe, and a 10K resistor is in place of the diode. Let's just tune. So it looks like it's 6 millivolts RMS, and that's the strongest signal on the band. Then we're going to use different levels of RF along with different levels of modulation, and we're going to observe the distortion we see. And that distortion should go up with the product detector type version. It should remain pretty good with the envelope. Everybody following me now? You ready to go along on this ride? And you're going to need some popcorn and maybe strong drink, because this is not hand waving. This is not mathematics. This should reveal at what level each of the methods kicks in. See, I don't believe that it's one or the other. I don't believe it's one or the other. I believe it's a little of both. That maybe one dominates at certain levels and the other dominates at certain levels. And we're going to try to determine that. Also, over here, you'll see I've got this new workstation, and I call it a new workstation. This is something that was paid for by my Patreon guys. All junk. I mean, it's a used circuit board. It's a used GPU. The case used to be beige. I spray painted it flat black. This is a junk computer, but it's very powerful. And that's where I'm going to be going next to improve my editing and my file saving and speed and all that stuff. This is my new workstation. Thank you, Patreon guys. Let's get this out of the way quick so we can move on to other types of detectors.
So let me get in trouble early. Diodes are not magic. We're treating the diode like it's a magic device. I'm going to use two terms, square law detection and peak detection. Now, both of these methods of detection are by rectification. I mean, what's the diode doing if you're not turning it on? So in our crystal radio case, it really can be shown that rectification is really equivalent to nonlinear multiplication. One is in the frequency domain and one is in the time domain. But they really are the same thing. We're turning a diode on and off. We're commutating a diode. The concept of an envelope is only real when we create it at the end of the process. Usually this is done through low-pass filtering. So envelope detection is a misunderstood term. The envelope is not created at the transmitter. It shows up after detection and filtering. Square law detection is the act of rectification or product detection in the square law region. Peak detection is simply the act of sampling the highest rectified voltage in the linear region. So in either case, either sampling or integrating or low-pass filtering these peaks are going to reproduce the message. And let's clear up a little confusion about the diodes. When we measure a diode with our meter using the diode function, we see a forward voltage of, say, 200, 300 millivolts. It's very tempting to think that the diode's not turned on till you hit it with that current that produces that forward voltage. Well, that's kind of silly because we know that most signals hitting our signal diode are well below 100 millivolts. In fact, they're below 1 millivolt. And yet we hear loud signals in our earphones. My point is that no matter what's happening in the detection process, the diode's being a diode. It's conducting more in one direction than in the other. And it's doing it at a very small signal level. The forward voltage tester in your meter, it might be a great way to roughly identify is it a silicon or a germanium diode, or get a general sense of the cut-in voltage. That is, it's indicative that this might be a more sensitive diode. But it's not going to tell you about that really small voltage stuff around the origin. This is the place where the diode starts to conduct. And in a germanium diode, it's very near the origin. How do we know this? Well, we know this because remember when I applied the bias? When I applied the bias to the germanium diode, it hardly helped at all in improving its sensitivity. The germanium diodes are very good at conducting at very, very low signals. So we prefer that germanium diode. Without rectification or current flowing in one direction more than the other, nothing would happen. No mixing, no rectification, no nothing. The diode actually has to be conducting for any of this to work. We see the curve, we see the square law region, then we see the linear region, but we need to understand what it looks like around the origin, below where they're showing you that the diode's conducting at all. Well, guess what? It is conducting. With any diode in a crystal set, with a proper input tune circuit, a proper impedance match to the diode, proper output impedance matching to the headphones, there are three regions that you could experience. The first region is the square law region. This is typically from the origin up to about minus 20 dBm. So that's, a few microvolts up to 20 millivolts. And, crystal radios can detect down at minus 70 dBm. Some high-performance crystal radios can even do better than that. The nonlinear region of the curve is where the output of the diode is directly proportional to the square of the input voltage. Then the curved region straightens out into the linear region. This is usually between minus 20 dBm and minus 10 dBm. That's around 20 millivolts to 70 millivolts. It continues until you get kind of the fully on saturation region between minus 10 to plus 25 dBm. So this is the 70 millivolt region to beyond 5 volts, where you might have to start being concerned about blowing up the diode. So again, there's no magic. The diode is conducting. It's doing what it does. It's rectifying the signal. However, the effective rectification in the square law region is different than rectifying in the linear region. The formulas show that in the square law region, the carrier with half the signal power in the carrier and 2 AM sidebands, each with a quarter power, this is 100% modulation, it'll produce a message signal when rectified and low-pass filtered. Other products will also be produced that cannot be filtered out. Operating as a multiplier, for instance, the sidebands against the carrier, you're going to get a 2x message signal artifact. There's also a DC component that we can block with a capacitor. So it's known that these spurs will become more pronounced with a higher modulation index in the square law region. Furthermore, it's known that the same AM signals at higher level in the linear region will produce less distortion. So that's going to be the tell. These are the effects I'm going to be looking for on the bench. In the square law region, I'll be looking for lots of products, lots of distortion that increases with the modulation index. In the linear region, I'll be looking for much less distortion. So let's see if we can get this done on the bench.
Let's do some quick validation on signal levels. Okay, I have an AM signal I've developed over here, and it's supposed to be 280 millivolts peak to peak. 280 millivolts peak to peak. Let's bring that over to our RMS voltmeter. Yeah, 100 millivolts RMS. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so that's a believable number. This is the input signal we're going to be bringing into the crystal radio. Also, the unity gain buffer had a little bit of distortion on it. So I ended up having to tickle the 10 meg resistor with a little bit of bias. As soon as I got around a volt or so on the bottom of the 10 meg, the output straightened right out. So the other buffer worked, but it had some distortion. And adding this bias reduced the distortion. And that's what we're trying to measure, so that's a more complete schematic of the unity gain buffer that I'm using to have an FET probe on the diode. Okay, we're looking at a pretty well modulated signal over here. 2.5 volts peak to peak, 90% modulation. We're sending that into the crystal set. I'm doing a distortion measurement over here, and I am reading around just under 2% distortion. That's not bad. I'm going to put that into the signal analyzer, and this is basically a spectrum analyzer at this point for audio. Okay, looks like it read it. You can see there's a little bit of distortion on the second harmonic of 1 kilohertz, which is 2 kilohertz. This is looking very good. As we lower the modulation, the distortion goes away completely. And it comes up when we overmodulate at 110. Okay? That's overmodulation. Notice how the distortion comes up with overmodulation. Okay, let's go back to something more reasonable. The detector, when it's operating in peak mode, is very low distortion. And this is why Steve, WA1QIX, insisted that his peak measuring modulation monitor that you're putting in, a pretty high voltage, 2 or 3, 4 volts, is what you want into his modulation analyzer. That's because he knows that his detector is going to be the least distortion when it's operating in the peak mode. So let's now go down into the square law region with the crystal radio, and let's see how it acts with various input levels as we go through the square law region of the diode, and with various modulation indexes. Now, we know in theory that when we are using the squaring method of detection, that there's a nasty second harmonic, just like the one we just saw, that will come up. And let's see what our distortion ends up being at the lower levels. Okay, I've created a modulated signal with 50 millivolts peak to peak. 50 millivolts peak to peak is certainly in the square law region of the diode. Looks to be about 20% modulation. Let's check it. 20% depth. So a 0.2 index on the modulation. I had to make the screen more sensitive, so the full scale is sitting at minus 70 dBV instead of minus 20 dBV. We can tune the crystal radio for maximum. We're just seeing a little tiny bit of distortion. It's not bad. Let's start to increase the modulation index. Here we go, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60, 70, 80, 90. We not only have a second order term, 2 times the modulating frequency, we also have a triple coming in. We can hear the signal. We can hear the signal, and the signal does have distortion. You can hear it. You can hear the distortion. We're in the square law mode now of detection. If we were to take a distortion measurement at this point, we would see that we only have 20 dBV. 20 dBV is going to be a fairly significant amount of distortion, but still, anything less than, say, 10%, your ear kind of ignores it. So the crystal set, even though it has some distortion in it, you're not going to notice it that much in your headphones. It's still going to sound okay to you. So now we've basically proven that we're probably looking at square law detection because of all these distortion products we get. So the next thing we should try at a reasonable level is what happens when we bring the power up and down. Does that also change the relationship? I'm going to have to change the scale. Now we're just going to bring up the level. It's certainly bringing up that triple, isn't it? And remember, our modulation percentage is only 50%. But increasing the level also causes more distortion as we climb up the curve. Then it starts to even out. Once we start to forward conduct and get into the linear region, it's pretty much leveled out. As we start to climb into the linear region, the distortion improves. So we had quite a ride there with this expose of the crystal radio. Certainly there are mistakes in this video, and I'm really looking forward to all the comments, criticisms. As usual, send your comments and criticisms to Radio Havana, Cuba, Post Office Box 7026, Havana, Cuba. Actually, the crystal radio itself has always been fascinating to me, as it has to the crystal radio community. So finding out things about the crystal radio that maybe are new or new thinking, it's worth the travel, it's worth the ride. So what did we learn? Let's settle back and think about what we learned. Okay, the first thing that we learned was that it's not like it's one or the other, okay? It's a diode, okay? A good friend of mine that happens to be an MIT engineer told me, Mike, it's like cutting meat. You have to have a knife, okay? The diode's the knife, the meat is the signal. Now, how you cut it depends on where you are on the diode's curve. If you're down below threshold, or what we call the forward conduction of a diode, you're not really below the forward conduction of the diode. It's still conducting all the way down to the origin, or where you can't measure it, more likely. We also learned that adding bias can enhance detection. It enhances detection because it brings you closer to that origin point where the first discontinuity occurs, allowing for mixing, detection, all of these things to happen once we get the diode into conduction. What's the distortion doing? The distortion is not doing much. You've got low signals. Some of these crystal radios are capable of signals as low as -60, -70, -80, -90 dBm. Some of your ham receivers can't even detect -90 dBm. So some of these crystal radios are pretty hot. And when you're down in that range, you certainly aren't doing old-fashioned peak detection. You're not turning the diode on enough to actually prove out half-wave rectification in a meaningful way. Something else is happening down there, and it's called mixing or product detection. We've proven that because of the math, and I did not want to get into the math in this video, that's for sure, but the math is what gave away that we might have these distortion products, and that gave me the hint that I might be able to do something with the signal analyzer. By the way, thank you for the borrowed equipment W2SW. Having decent equipment in the shack for a change makes a big difference with videos like this. That's the kickoff of the crystal radio, and I can't go any further in detectors. We'll let this one stand on its own. I hope you guys enjoyed this video where we investigated the actual modes that the crystal radio uses to detect those signals in your Baldwin headphones.